Good evening and welcome to Bentham House, home of the Faculty of Laws at University College London. We've come together in person and online to celebrate the inauguration of Professor Ronan McCrea. I'm Stephen Vaughan, Vice Dean of the Faculty and your host. Not every university carries on the tradition of inaugural lectures. I think this is a real shame. They're always very happy occasions, an opportunity to say in public and with pride, in front of family, friends, peers and others, this person is one of us. And so I was delighted to be asked to host this evening, not only because Ronan is such a brilliant member of the faculty, but also because he's such a good friend. So our approach for this evening is as follows. I'll say a few words about Ronan before handing over to Professor Conor Gearty from the LSE, who is this evening's chair. We then turn to the main event, Ronan's inaugural lecture, before drinks and nibbles in the hub for those of you with us in person. Ronan studied law at Trinity College Dublin before moving to London to undertake an MSc in comparative politics at the London School of Economics. He qualified as a barrister in 2003, undertook pupillage at Matrix Chambers, worked as a legal officer at the London Refugee Centre, and then as a referendar at the Court of Justice of the European Communities. He completed his PhD at the LSE in 2009. After a short period at Reading, Ronan joined UCL in 2011 as a lecturer, was promoted to senior lecturer in 2013, and became a professor in 2018. He's held a range of distinguished visiting and other appointments, including as a Jean Monnet Fellow at the EUI, as Associate Counsel at the NYU's Brennan Centre, as a visiting professor at the Central European University in Budapest, and as trustee of the NGO Just for Kids Law. Ronan's research focuses on the relationship between religion and law, on European Union law and constitutional law. His work has appeared in various languages, English, French, Spanish, and has been reviewed and cited not only in various areas of law, constitutional law, EU law, discrimination, human rights, and so on, but also across disciplines in law and sociology, political science, political theory, religious studies, and political economy. This is a real mark of distinction. Another note of distinction is how seemingly effortlessly Ronan is able to translate his scholarship for a range of audiences. He is a regular columnist in the Irish Times, a frequent contributor in Irish to TG4 and Radio na Gaeltachta, and there was a period when he was repeatedly in taxis to and fro the BBC, Sky, Reuters, France Info for commentary on Brexit. In the context of education, Ronan has shown significant leadership of and contributions to EU law and public law, as well as the creation of his innovative LLM module, Religion, State and Law. His students adore him, sometimes to the extent, and I know this from bitter personal experience, that if you happen to share the same students in your class as are taking Ronan's classes, they will tell you repeatedly and to your face just how brilliant he is. I've tried not to be too offended when that happens. As a colleague, I can give Ronan no higher accolade than to say he is a good citizen, kind and caring with academic and professional services colleagues, giving of himself, always willing to step forward and lend a hand. His charisma, uniqueness, nerve and talent are very much appreciated by everyone in the faculty. Let me turn now to Professor Conor Gearty, our chair for this evening. Some people are getting the RuPaul joke there a few seconds late. Conor was born in Ireland and educated at University College Dublin and Cambridge. He then spent 7 years as a fellow in Cambridge before moving to King's College London. After a decade at King's, he then went to the LSE in 2002 as Professor of Human Rights Law, where until 2009, he was also the first director of the LSE Centre for the Study of Human Rights. Conor is, as many of us here this evening already know, a multiply recognised world-leading expert on civil liberties, terrorism and human rights. Like Ronan, Conor draws on his scholarship to lead and drive forward public debate on a wide range of issues and has, among many other matters of esteem, written extensively for the Tablet, the London Review of Books, Prospect and Renewal. Conor is a Fellow of the British Academy and currently its Vice President, Social Sciences, a bencher of the Ancient Inn of Court, Middle Temple, a member of the Royal Irish Academy, as well as a bencher of the King's Inn in Dublin. Conor was one of the founding members of Matrix Chambers in 2000, and last year he was made an honorary QC. Conor, we're delighted you agreed to join us this evening as chair, and I shall now hand over to you.
I think that's right. That was just lovely, wasn't it, from Stephen? So thank you very much, Stephen. We don't know anything about you. I feel as though I should retaliate with some well-prepared words about your youth and so on, but I won't. I will, however, I'm not going to speak about it. I will, however, tell you about the first time I ever saw this guy. And it has left an immense, indelible impression. In 2003, referred to by Stephen, Matrix Chambers was the hottest ticket. It just started. It was where all the trainees wanted to be. And we had a galaxy of stars, none of whom I'd heard of before I joined it, but nevertheless they were to people who knew something stars. And they included the Prime Minister's wife, which was amazing. We'd all heard of her. And so when the thousands applied to become trainees at Matrix, they all, with bated breath, swatted every aspect of everything. Except Ronan. The thousands were weeded down to 700, who were weeded down to 200, who were weeded down to 6, or was it 7? And the 7 were brought in and spent a day being rigorously interrogated by the barristers at Matrix Chambers, the 24 founding members of this operation. And they anticipated they'd be asked about the Human Rights Act, then pretty new, and so they swatted that up. And they came equipped to answer in great detail on this and that aspect of it, and which the leading cases were and so on. Late in the day, I think coming from Paris, was this Irish fellow. Now, he came in, the last interviewee, and it became apparent quite early on that he had never heard of the Human Rights Act. He was rumoured to speak Swedish. But though we were partisan to Scandinavia, that was not regarded as enough of a consolation. However, he answered every question hypothetically with enormous precision and dumbfounded my colleagues, a large number of them, whose job it was to pick these people apart. In vain, and he hasn't heard this, did I argue that every Irishman was just like that. These Trinity boys were a dime a dozen. You couldn't get on a bus without that level of repartee with the conductor. And, of course, I failed. And he was ushered in, and it was an astonishing achievement. And then Ronan had before him an incredibly, probably, certainly successful barrister's career, because he was a brilliant barrister and remains, as we all know, a brilliant lawyer. So what happened? Ronan came to see me. Ronan, do you mind if I talk about it? I had the double life of being a barrister and an academic. And he came to see me in LSE. And he said, I don't think I like it. He said, I don't think I like it. I said, but you know, the world wants this. I mean, my goodness, what are you talking about? And then I asked you a question. I said, when you get the 26 lever arch files, there are people here so dull they relish it. Not looking at anybody in particular. I said, does your heart skip a beat with excitement? Or does your heart sink? And one said, my heart sinks. I said, do you remember this advice? I said, get out. So then, what happened was, this man built an entirely fresh career in the university environment and achieved outstanding success. Outstanding success. A PhD thesis and a book and subsequent engagements to which Stephen has alluded. We're going to get a sense of it here now. Of course, he's at UCL. There is taken for granted academic excellence. I mean, exceptional academic excellence. But Stephen has alluded to something, and I think what we've got here is an unusual level of fearlessness. Now, courage is one thing. Fearlessness is something slightly different. To pursue an intellectual agenda because it is what speaks to you as a scholar. And you do so without regard to the turmoil around you, the correctness of this or that. As some of you will know, Ronan's has never been simply in the box marked good egg. It's more complicated. And he hasn't weaved a story that goes down with every community all the time. So fearlessness in the following of the intellect and fearlessness in the articulation of the position. One thing that I think is unusually remarkable about Ronan is his capacity to push the argument to the point where it becomes uneasy. And that's a tremendous thing and a real gift, but it's fueled by a lack of interest in pleasing and a kind of greater concern with the idea than with its pleasant reception, even by people with power, completely indifferent to that. And then Stephen alluded to it as well in his introductory remarks. This willingness to engage is really, really important in our world. I have always thought it extraordinary that we have these extremely fortunate jobs in which we are paid by somebody, the state usually, to have thoughts, and then we forbear from communicating them out of a sense of modesty. What a waste. And so Ronan has been independently engaged in the communication of his ideas in the various places. I mean, takes it too far, you know, the cab going to that studio and this studio. What language do you want it in? I can offer the following. I mean, you know, boasting about, with, oh, no offense, radiant a guilty, you're enormous. I mean, I know you're primed him to do it, but I mean, and I think that is a model for us academics, actually. Our story comes along or doesn't. So his story is a huge story. Just like war is suddenly a new huge story. Just as after 11 September, understanding radical Islam was a huge story. We do not know when our story comes along. And when it comes along, we need to stand up and say, let me through, I know something about it. And he's been doing that for a large number of years. And I'm delighted to chair this. It's been on and postponed so often. I've been coming here for the last 3 years on the off chance that it's on. I've finally got the right day synchronized. Can we ask Ronan McCrea to deliver his inaugural lecture as professor? He's not quite a professor yet. Stephen's been clear on that. Does it depend on the quality of the lecture? Ronan, off you go.
Can you all hear me, right? So it's a blessing to have such colleagues and friends. It's not a blessing to follow them when you're speaking, when they do such a generous and wonderful job. I'm also really grateful to all of you for coming, and I'll actually get to the Oscars bit of my speech at the end, as long as Will Smith isn't in the audience. This lecture was meant to be delivered in the third week of March 2020, optimistically postponed to the first week of May 2020. It's actually more postponed than that because I gave a version of this paper as in my job interview for UCL in 2010, promising that it would shortly be finished. Look, it's with trepidation that you embark on giving a talk about law and religion in Europe and what's meant to be a happy occasion. Because it's not just that religion is a sensitive matter, but if you talk about religion in today's Europe, you're not just talking about religion. You're diving into a host of other hot topics like immigration, multiculturalism, racial discrimination, terrorism, post-colonialism, all of which provoke angry debates in their own right. And in these debates, it's often not clear what side a good progressive should back. On top of this, all the debates take place against the background of Europe's history of colonialism and looking down on non-white, non-Christian cultures that can make otherwise attractive arguments about the equality of men and women or secularism as fundamental European values. It can make them appear like another incidence of talking down to those from other cultures. So in my talk tonight, I want to avoid too many potential sources of anger and to focus on two interrelated whys. So the first why is why the legal limits on religious influence over law, politics, and society are in general becoming more restrictive at a time when Europe has overall never been less religious. The second why is considering why is it that, given that these restrictions raise clear issues of fundamental rights, freedom of religion, discrimination, all that kind of stuff, why have the European courts in general been unwilling to interfere with them? So first we'll discuss how the law around religion in Europe is changing, then show how by and large the European courts have decided not to interfere with that process, and then talk a little bit about why they've taken such a hands-off approach and make some broader points about why I think that that hands-off approach is the least worst option available. I'll be talking about Western Europe, basically, mainly the EU, kind of 15 countries minus Greece, because the issues that I'm talking about arise in a different form in Central and Eastern Europe. So first, how is religion changing? Well, in international terms, Western Europe overall stands out for its non-religious nature. It has some of the lowest rates of religious belief and practice in the world, and those rates are falling. In political terms, religious influence over law and politics is also low and falling. There are some countries like England that retain symbolic relationships to a particular faith, but no country other than the Vatican in Western Europe is a theocracy. And in all states, politics, religion, and law are regarded as separate realms. There's no real equivalent to the significant political influence of the Christian right in the US or Brazil, or the political Islam movements in many Muslim majority countries. But that said, the sociologist Jose Casanova has noted that even though Christian churches in Europe have largely accepted the separation of religion and politics, they've remained active and influential in relation to what he calls life world issues. And that's issues relating to the beginning and end of life, sex, and the family. And that meant that in a lot of countries, the law about abortion, assisted suicide, divorce, gay marriage, have for a long time retained a residual Christian imprint. But in Western Europe, even this last bastion of religious influence has fallen. Divorce and abortion are now universally available. Gay marriage is the law in every Western European country except Italy and Switzerland and a couple of microstates. Assisted suicide law is advancing steadily in a number of countries. But strangely, at the same time that religion has been declining, public debate has been marked by this anxious discussion about the need to limit religious influence in public life and to reinforce the secular nature of our societies and states. In recent years, Western European societies have been convulsed by debates about limitations on the right to mock religion, worries that religious schools are promoting illiberal values, and they've seen proposals to enshrine the requirement that people sign up to beliefs in secularism, sex equality, and tolerance of sexual freedom as part of naturalization processes, and angry debates about the presence of religious symbols and clothing in public contexts. And this is because, as you all know, religion in Europe is linked to a whole series of other developments, particularly migration, and this means that the pattern of overall decline in religiosity conceals important differences. The regulation of the role of religion in society has moved from a matter of striking a balance between Christianity and secular humanist influences to becoming a multi-actor relationship between a large but declining Christianity, rapidly growing irreligion, rapidly growing Islam, and other religious minorities, but Islam being the religion of the large majority of migrants to Europe. And this has meant that some of the areas where the law had settled on a position that Christians and secularists could both live with, that position has proved unsatisfactory to many Muslims, and we've seen a series of controversies in areas such as blasphemy laws, religious symbols at work, and issues of gender and sexuality. So how is this changing the law? Well, there's a consistent pattern of replacement of informal, limits on religious influence with much more formal and legal restrictions. So although it has been the most secular continent in the world for some time, strict rules around religion in Europe and the law on paper in Europe was not actually that secular. De facto secular societies coexisted with laws on paper that were not very secular at all. So there was a 2003 survey by Gearty and John Madeley, who showed that not a single European country, even France, had a relationship to religion that would have separated the standards of the case law of the US Supreme Court for separation of law and religion and the state. Not one. Many European countries retained state churches. Others levied taxes on behalf of the faithful and for the benefit of religions. Virtually all subsidized state schools and hospitals, none of which would have been permitted in the US. And what I take from this is not that European states were actually heavily religious, but the limits on religion took a different form. While states were on paper endorsing and giving religions certain privileges, the actual impact of those privileges was qualified by social and cultural expectations that limited the actual influence of religion over law, politics, and the state. So to take an example, England and Denmark, like Saudi Arabia, all have official religions. But obviously what that meant in real terms for the relationship between religion and the state was very different in London and Copenhagen than in Riyadh. In England and Denmark, there is an official religion, but everybody is kind of expected to know that in terms of substance, politics and law are largely separate from religion in a way that they are not in Saudi Arabia. This kind of let's pretend, or as long as you don't really mean it approach that uses social and cultural norms to qualify the legal situation on paper extended much beyond the symbolic relationship of religion to the state. So for example, in relation to mockery of religion, until recently, at least 10 Western European states had anti-blasphemy laws or equivalents on their books. At the same time, there was also, in most of those states, a vigorous culture of mocking religion. And it was understood that although those laws might not be entirely a dead letter, it was expected that religion would put up with criticism and even mockery. In other areas, the law just wasn't involved. There were social norms that did the relevant work. Most countries did not have rules around religious symbols at work. There was a kind of social convention that by and large people were reticent about their faith at work contexts. And it was also generally expected that those from migrants and migrant backgrounds, migrants who became new citizens, would be only too keen to embrace these secular European ways. And so nobody would even thought of introducing a kind of duty to do so as part of naturalization. And it's this complacent approach that has changed. European countries are becoming less and less willing to leave the relationship between religion, the state, and law as a kind of grey area, and are now using the law to impose black and white rules in this area. The nod and wink approach to blasphemy has not survived the post-Danish cartoon Salman Rushdie, Charlie Hebdo era. Since 2008, amongst Western European states, the UK, Norway, Netherlands, Iceland, Denmark, Malta, and Ireland have all abolished their blasphemy laws. And in 2013, EU foreign ministers unanimously agreed guidelines that call for the repeal of blasphemy laws, i.e. have adopted a much more black and white position on the issue than they had before. Same is true in relation to the wearing of religious symbols. An expectation that people would generally be reticent about their faith at work is being replaced by rules that mandate when people can and cannot wear certain religious symbols. In France, the obligation on civil servants to be religiously neutral has been interpreted and extended to cover anyone working in any government-funded role. Some German länder have restricted the wearing of religious symbols for civil servants as part of moves to remove all religious symbols from state offices. Similar moves have been seen in Denmark. And in the private sector too, informal arrangements are being replaced by much more black and white rules. In the leading EU case about religious symbols at work, Achbita from Belgium, I thought it was very interesting that what had happened in the course of that case was that the employer had an informal, unwritten policy banning religious symbols, which is then formalized into a written rule. Similarly, an expectation that migrants to Europe would embrace the idea of secular politics and sexual liberalism is increasingly being replaced by measures that encourage them and in some cases penalize people for not doing so. This has been seen in the proliferation of what are called integration tests as part of naturalization, which make the grant of residency or citizenship contingent on being in agreement with certain secular or liberal principles. Whether liberal is still the right word in that situation is contestable. But these tests have been applied in Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, France, and to some degree in the UK. In France, the Conseil d'État, which is the highest administrative court, upheld the refusal of citizenship to a Muslim woman on the grounds that her, quote, radical practice of her religion, which included the wearing of a niqab, was incompatible with the fundamental values of French society. And in 2010, the French Justice Minister refused to grant citizenship to a man on the basis that he required his wife to be fully veiled and did not let her speak or leave the house without his permission. Nice guy. These worries have extended the education system, where the schools have been increasingly placed under obligations to actively promote secular and liberal norms. In France, schools have kind of almost always historically, in the last century or so, been seen as having a role in promoting Republican values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But this was reinforced in 2004 when a ban on ostentatious religious symbols in school was introduced. In Denmark, much more radical measures have been taken. In areas that have high unemployment, high crime, and high migration, children must attend publicly funded nurseries for 25 hours a week and must take classes in Danish values. Even in Britain, which has had a long history of seeing itself as much more pragmatic and less ideological than France, things have been moving in the French direction. Following the controversy in relation to what was being taught in some Muslim majority schools in Birmingham, the government required all schools to teach what are called fundamental British values, which are said to include democracy, individual liberty, and tolerance of different beliefs and mutual respect. Interestingly, the schools that have been most affected by those rules have been ultra-Orthodox schools, Jewish schools, which had kind of been flying under the radar before these rules were announced. So, these rules, done in the name of liberalism, are troubling to many liberals. They raise serious issues in terms of European law. Restrictions on the wearing of religious symbols restrict the right to freedom of religion, freedom of expression and privacy guaranteed by the European Convention on Human Rights and EU law. Integration tests can be seen as discriminatory and also restrictive of religious freedom. Laws allowing requiring schools to promote particular values potentially breach the right of parents to have their beliefs respected by the education system. And EU law particularly has a very strong history in non-discrimination. And these laws are clearly potentially discriminatory because they penalise religions such as Sikhism and Islam that place much more emphasis on practices and wearing things and taking certain actions than the very belief-focused Christian theology. And also because, particularly discriminatory, because their impact is so often disproportionately on women, particularly as in the case of measures to restrict the wearing of the headscarf. What's more, it's undeniable that some of those supporting these restrictive laws do not do so from the most honourable of motives. Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National in France has become a champion of secularism and equality of men and women, not because of sincere commitment, but because they've discovered that these issues can be a stick with which to beat migrant origin communities. And that can put a particularly ugly complexion on laws, such as those I'm discussing, that tend to have a disproportionate impact on ethnic minorities. But despite all of these reasons for the European courts to step in, they have generally refused to do so. And I'll just have a couple of examples for time. European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has turned down all of the challenges to France's restrictions on religious symbols in the public service and in school, repeatedly stating secularism is compatible with the values of the European Convention on Human Rights on the grounds, inter alia, that it promotes religious coexistence. In the case of SAS versus France, the court was willing to take the idea of coexistence beyond even the state sector and upheld a general prohibition on public wearing of a face veil in public on the basis that this was a legitimate means to try, as they say, to live together. Courts have been very hands-off in relation to religious symbols in schools. In a case called Dahlab versus Switzerland, They said the Swiss authorities were entitled to require a teacher not to wear religious symbols, in this case the headscarf. But then in a case called Lauzzi versus Italy, they said that Italy could retain crucifixes in schools provided the overall effect was not oppressive. Even in relation to blasphemy, where a political consensus is forming, the court's been absolutely unwilling to second-guess national choices and has refused to overturn anti-blasphemy laws in Austria and Turkey. The European Court of Justice, which is the EU Supreme Court, has also been hands-off. In the case Parliament versus Council, they said integration conditions for migrants were not per se a validation of fundamental rights. In Achbita versus Group 4 Security, the court said that private employers could require employees not to wear any religious symbols at work, provided the ban was consistently enforced and did not target any one faith. The common theme in all of these cases is deference towards the state. When it comes to regulating religion's role in society, the court has almost never intervened. European judges have been content for the state to restrict religious symbols at work or not to have religious symbols in the classroom or to ban blasphemous speech or not to. All they have done is require that those laws that exist are applied in a consistent, proportionate way. Now, this approach has been almost unanimously criticised by scholars. The courts have been accused of being cowardly, of being complicit in discrimination, or of themselves stigmatising minorities. And from my point of view, the courts have certainly been cautious, even timid. Now, there's an awful lot of ink spilled about how far courts should go in regulating social problems in general, what counts as too activist or not activist enough, in fact, recent work from yourself in the London Review of Books. But what I'm more interested in thinking about is the why. Why is it both that Western European states are turning to the law to regulate religion's role in society, usually in a more restrictive way? And why is it that the European courts have been so deferential and cautious in reacting to these changes? Well, okay, so first, why the turn to law? So what these laws restricting religion's expression or influence in society represent, above all, is a loss of confidence. It would never have occurred to secularists in the 1960s or 1970s to pass a law encouraging migrants to Europe to adopt secular values. People in Europe at the time were full of post-colonial arrogance that presumed that because secularism had largely been achieved in Europe, it was the way of the future that, inverted commas, less developed societies would follow. And they were drawing on over 100 years of academic certainty from the 19th century, from foundational figures like Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, right up to the 1990s, where the academic consensus was the decline of religion and secularization of society was an inevitable byproduct of modernization. Scholars were certain that as societies modernized, religion declined. But that confidence is now gone. The last few decades saw the emergence of modern, wealthy societies in the Gulf that did not become secular. Across the Muslim world, religion became a more powerful element of politics as the 80s and 90s wore on. The Christian right in America became increasingly influential. By 1999, the sociologist David Berger, who previously argued that secularization was inevitable, conceded that outside of Europe, the world was, quote, as furiously religious as ever. At the same time, historians, political theorists, and legal theorists have shown us that secularism is neither a default nor actually fully neutral. Mark Lilla, a historian of ideas, showed how the idea of that politics is an area distinct from religion grew as a response to the specific problems caused by religious conflict in Europe in the 16th, 17th century. Charles Taylor, Cécile Laborde, and others have shown that secularism, as Charles Taylor puts it, grew like weeds in the cracks of Christian theology. It has an undeniably Christian origin. As the liberal Muslim writer Shadi Hamid has noted, there is simply no reason to assume that predominant patterns with Islam will follow the predominant pattern of European Christianity and accept separation of religion and state. After all, as he points out, the two faiths have very separate histories and Islam has its own very rich intellectual traditions. Why, Hamid argues, should we be surprised that two faiths have different approaches to the relationship of religion, politics, and law, particularly because Christianity outside Europe is not even following this secular Christian approach. So once we discard the unevidenced and arrogant colonialist assumptions, the particular ways of doing things that became predominant in Europe are the innovative ways that everyone is going to follow, a certain secularist loss of confidence is inevitable. When large-scale migration to Europe from more devout and mainly Muslim areas of the world began in the post-war period, arrogant post-colonialist assumptions were all the rage in Europe. As the French scholar Olivier Roy puts it, nobody was concerned when a grandmother from the Rif Mountains wore a hijab after migrating to France. But when her French-raised and educated granddaughter did the same, they found it profoundly disturbing. Why? Well, because it challenged deep-seated ideas they had about what was modern and who the future would belong to. A symbol of a fading religious past seems fine. A symbol of an increasingly religious future can seem frightening. Viewed in this light, it becomes clear what is happening. European states no longer have sufficient confidence to leave the relationship between the law and religion in the state a grey area, or to hand it over to social norms, to deliver the kind of religious limitations on religious influence that they expect, that they require, or that they desire, and they're pressing the law into action to reinforce those limits. Having assumed that kind of history had a direction, and that direction was one that made societies progressively less religious and more secular, Western European societies have lost the secular self-confidence and are now trying to get the law to do the job they previously thought history would do for them. Now, this approach has a lot of drawbacks. Law is a very blunt tool. Liberals are rightly worried by the restrictions and fundamental rights involved in laws, for instance, that ban face veiling. Discrimination lawyers are rightly worried about the impact on racial and religious minorities of rules restricting religious symbols at work. The cynical use of principles such as gay rights, feminism, or secularism by Marine Le Pen and others to exclude can make otherwise worthy principles seem quite suspect. So the courts have a valuable role to play in protecting fundamental rights and vulnerable minorities. So why then do I think that by and large the European courts have been right not to intervene and to take a hands-off approach? Well, the answer to that is doubt. When European courts intervene, they are laying down the law to a very large number of states. And that course of action requires a high degree of confidence on the part of the court that, in the case of religion, states who act to toughen up restrictions on religious influence or religious expression are acting illegitimately or excessively. But how can courts in Europe have that certainty? Yes, some of the laws may be backed by some people for the wrong reasons, but that's a perennial problem in law. There are lots of many rules on restricting ritual slaughter are backed both by anti-immigration parties and Green parties. Whose reasons do you choose? There are good reasons for law or there are not. If their motives are bad, there's not that much we can do about it. There are good reasons to want to maintain limits on religious influence over law and politics that have grown up in Europe for the past decades. I grew up in a state where religion held significant political power and which decriminalized male homosexuality in 1993. So there are good reasons for them to limit that influence. Given the teachings of most mainstream religions, religious influence over law and politics will be bad for a number of groups, particularly women, particularly gays and lesbians. When politics is conducted on religious lines, swing votes can disappear. With eternal life at stake, the stakes of political conflict become frighteningly high. As Thomas Hobbes said centuries ago, other animals kill to eat and reproduce. Only humans kill to get into heaven. Across Europe, people by and large have the freedom to believe or not to believe, and within the private sphere to live in accordance to religious tenets or to sin to their heart's content. That is not a natural or inevitable condition. It is historically vanishingly rare, and it is actually, even in the broader current world, rare and precious. It's legitimate for states to wish to uphold the limits on religious influence and the limits on the role of religion in politics that have largely been achieved in Europe. The question is not, therefore, if laws that seek to promote these limits are legitimate. The question is, are those laws unfairly targeted, excessive, or ineffective? They may well be. And one of the limited interventions made by the European courts was in the Achbita case in the European Court of Justice, where the court ruled that any restrictions on religious symbols were acceptable only if they did not target any particular faith and applied across the board to all symbols of religion and belief. Now, it is also possible that even if fairly applied, these laws are going further than is necessary, and they may produce a counterproductive sense of victimization and exclusion. But if we, wrong page. But we don't know that yet. Once we drop the arrogant and unevidenced assertion that history has some kind of inevitable arc that bends towards liberal values and secularism, we actually have to acknowledge that we just don't know what the best way to proceed is. Europe has undergone 3 huge changes in the last 70 years, each of which on its own would have been sufficient to produce endless unpredictable consequences. After more than a millennium in which Christianity exercised overwhelming social and cultural influences, levels of belief and practice have quite suddenly collapsed in a few decades. For centuries, most Europeans went about their day-to-day life believing they were being observed and judged by the Christian God. Most people no longer believe that. The consequences that that change alone would bring have to be myriad and completely unpredictable. Secondly, after centuries in which non-Christian religious communities were a very small minority, Western Europe has, since 1960, developed a large and growing Muslim minority and significant minorities of other faiths. Many critics of the timidity of the European courts speak as if there is a large store of precedents of changes like that going off smoothly, and that any worries are the product of prejudice or delusions. But that's just not the case. Actually, across the world, societies such as Lebanon, Cyprus, Iraq, and Nigeria that have salient religious divides spend an awful lot of time and effort seeking to manage their religious divisions. And often, as in the case of Lebanon and indeed Northern Ireland, have had to abandon democracy for what's called consociational democracy, where each community has a veto. And the final change is that Europe has undergone a revolution in terms of gender and sexuality, where roles, institutions, and norms that govern people's life course for centuries have been suddenly overturned. That also has the effect of making a duty, a legal duty, on, say, migrants and those candidates for naturalization, a duty to respect basic values, a much more demanding standard for arrivals from devout conservative places than it would have been before. A migrant from Algeria or Pakistan arriving in Paris or London in 1950 would have found the thing were a bit more relaxed than at home, but in fact would have encountered a basically familiar setup. Sex before marriage was taboo, homosexuality was regarded with universal disgust, and the law and society promoted the subordination of wives to their husbands. In 2020, a migrant making the same journey will leave a still fairly conservative atmosphere, but arrive at a place in which not having sex until you're married is regarded as weird, equality between the spouses is the law, and homophobia, not homosexuality, is the sin. A values gap has become a values chasm. Now, the demand that migrants support and potential citizens support the basic values of their new home is actually one I support, but we have to recognize that it has become a much more demanding standard than before, and that it is liberals who have moved the goalposts by including historically unprecedented sexual freedom and gender equality as part of society's basic values. A post-Christian, partly Muslim, sexually free Europe is a Europe that is very different from what went before. No one with any historical perspective can think that we can be confident about how such a Europe turns out. There's often an unhelpful tendency to view history in a kind of the end way, as in gays were oppressed for centuries, then there was decriminalization, then there was gay marriage, the end. Or women were discriminated against for centuries, then we got this equal pay, and then we got Women's Property Act, and then we got legal equality, the end. That is absurdly deterministic. There is no way of knowing that after 25 years of tolerance, after centuries of oppression, is the end of the story. Or the 20th, maybe slightly longer in the case of gender equality, the recognition of the principle after centuries of subordination of women to men could be possibly the end of the story. We don't know what's the end of the story or what's a blip. What seems permanent often passes away. The history of Europe is littered with countries that existed for centuries and names no one anywhere remembers anymore. Like Burgundy. Who thinks about Burgundy anymore? Burgundy lasted for 800 years, or 600, anyway. I don't even know. But if you think that feminist emancipation once achieved cannot be undone, talk to some Iranian women or read leaks from the US Supreme Court. History does not have an end. It is ongoing and unpredictable. If we accept that secularism, liberalism are desirable but not destiny and not guaranteed to win out by some allegedly inevitable historical process, the question becomes, what do societies do to uphold them? In my view, the changes that Europe has undergone in relation to religion are so large and so recent that judges of European courts cannot possibly be confident enough to say that they know what options are best and to impose them across the board. After all, many in France argue that if they'd been just a little less secular and more multicultural, they'd be better off. But many in the Netherlands argue that they'd be much better off if they'd been less multicultural and more secularist in their approach. Europe is still experimenting with what works best. And it would be the height of intellectual arrogance for a European court to decide at this stage that it had hit on the winning formula. This doesn't mean that the laws I've been discussing are the best way of doing things. They should often be criticized, but critics should have the humility not to act as if they themselves have the ideal solution, especially if they don't articulate that solution. Too often, academia consists of pure critique with no solutions. Worse, that pure critique is often based on unarticulated certainties. This is the bit we said I don't mind pissing people off. Based on unarticulated certainties that we all know what works best. If you reject laws that seek to reinforce restrictions on religious influence, be clear why you're doing so. If it's because you don't think secularism is worth defending, fine, but please say so. If it's because you think these laws are unnecessary, fine, but tell us why you think they're unnecessary and why you're not relying on some allegedly inevitable historical theory that religion always fades away or becomes liberal. Perhaps you think secularism is worth defending, but those laws are not the best way to do it. Even better, but do let me know what your alternative proposal is to achieve the same goal. Solutions from academics are important because they're so difficult. It is not the case that societies are naturally fair and free and just, and that privilege and disadvantage are like stains on a kind of naturally perfect cloth that could be scraped and washed off. Often, some privileges and unfairnesses are woven into the cloth from the start, and it's very hard work to work out how to remove them without tearing the fabric of the cloth altogether. It's the kind of difficult, non-applause gathering work that is important for academics to do. Now, I don't have any solutions myself, I have to say. I do have serious reservations about European states' turn to law and their attempts to cope with the changing landscape of religion in Europe. You don't want to fall into the trap identified by G.K. Chesterton when he noticed how many people opposed religion because it was oppressive, but were then willing to put up with endless oppressive measures to get at religion. These laws may compromise liberal values too much. They may not even work and could easily backfire. I certainly think that those who propose them need to think carefully about how they appear in the light of Europe's colonial past. But I also recognize that we're all feeling our way in the dark. Europe has undergone changes of such magnitude that nobody can be certain about how things will turn out or be certain of what the best way is to ensure that freedom of and from religion that has been achieved in Europe persists. In these circumstances, I think the European courts have been right not to get involved and not to be modest about their ability to identify at this stage ideal solutions. Thank you. Thank you very much. I also now have the Oscars bit. First, thank you all for coming. Turning up is such a lovely thing to do for people, and it's so lovely to see people who've travelled from quite far, and colleagues and friends and people from your past and also my future, hopefully here. I want to thank Cash Balgoon, who, I don't know if you're here, who has organised this all so well. I know one person was saying he feels he knows her already because he had so many emails, but she did a fantastic job, and Lisa Penfold as well in the event. I want to thank our chair, not for showing me up, but I want to thank because you actually said to me in the meeting you referred to, and an email afterwards, quote, academia is a great way to engage with the world and with life. And when I think of my career, I just think, God, I've had such a great time. It is a great way to engage with life. We have problems, we have declining pensions, but we also have a great job. We get to teach really bright young people. We get to write about things that interest us, that we think are important. Think of all these, I've traveled to Florence and Brussels and Paris and Budapest and dinners and discussions with people who are interested in the same things I'm interested in. What a great life. And actually, I'm just lucky I've had that chance, because I wouldn't have had that chance if you hadn't, and you were underselling your role because you invited me in to your office at a low point. And you didn't need to bother in my professional life. And you said, I think you should do it. And I think often you need to be told that something is for you. And I didn't think I was well read enough to do a PhD, and I didn't think it was for me. And you said, I think you should do it. And that made me, I wouldn't have done a PhD if you hadn't sent me that email. So that's a really great thing to do. I think a lot of people, one of the things people need to be told, and I hope I do this for students, is this is for you. And that's a really good thing to do. You did that for me, and I hope I do it for other people. The other thing I think is just, that gave me a chance. And when I had cancer when I was 22, the thing that bothered me most was, I'm not going to get a chance, right? I won't have a chance for a career. And I have. But that's only because of so many people and institutions. Our chair, my parents and brother, family are here, who really encouraged my education, which began in 1981. When I went on to doing, I started in 1981, and I started then doing a PhD at 28. But they've encouraged me in that way and in a myriad of other ways. All the friends who are here, who've been around for such great times and making the effort to come, that means an awful lot. I have to say, it doesn't trip off most Irish mouths, but I have to say that the British state has been very good to me. I came here on the Foreign Office Chevening Scholarship. Wouldn't have come. That's what brought me here. Scholarships from the PhD for the Arts and Humanities Research Council kept me here. I got a lot of funding from Gray's Inn to do the bar. I'm very conscious of how expensive our courses are and how we have to really do things to keep doors open for people. I have had so much help from those kind of institutions, those kind of funding bodies. And I'm glad that I have colleagues like Stephen and Lucinda who are working very hard to do that. But it's something we do have to think about. And it's something, the support I've got from a country who, I wasn't even a citizen. That was really something. I want to thank all the people who've helped me over the years, all the lovely colleagues, right? I know when my parents talk about their careers, I noticed that they mainly talk about the people they met. And I don't know if anyone, I do know actually, no one's going to be reading the articles I've written in 100 years. But I do know that I will always remember the people I've met. These lovely colleagues. I had a beautiful introduction from Stephen, his great friend, and so many of you would be invidious to mention. But the colleagues in LSE, the Court of Justice, Reading, Budapest, European University Institute, and UCL. We've had a great time. It's been really a pleasure to work with almost all of you. And with all the help I've got, I hope I've done some useful work. I think I've done some of my work I'm proud of. No one else was interested in EU law and religion before I did it. Some of my research, I'm proud to have deconstructed and criticized things, but actually I'm also think that what you construct and you maintain is as important or more important than what you deconstruct. And I think also of teaching in that regard. And I think we don't talk enough about teaching, I think, but through that we help raise the next generation of lawyers. And that's how we make a contribution to continuing that system. Critique and pointing out the flaws is good work. We also have to be really grateful for what we have. We don't want to teach students the flaws of everything and the values of nothing. Because if we're not grateful for what we have, we won't be vigilant enough about keeping it. Only a tiny proportion of humans over history have lived under a system where they're governed by rules and not individual whim, and where those rules are interpreted by independent judges. That system is not natural, it's not inevitable, it's historically vanishingly rare, and we need to give it some love to sustain it. For all its imperfections, it's a miracle that we have that system. And I think that's the best thing we've done. I think through teaching, we help to sustain that, to teach students about what a great thing that is and what the law is. I think that's the best thing. Thank you.
Ronan, that was an incredibly powerful lecture. Thank you. You took us, as Conor predicted you would, to some important and also uneasy places. And so, on behalf of the Provost, it gives me enormous pleasure to formally inaugurate you as Professor of Constitutional and European Law.